Okay, hello and welcome. My name is Geena Constantin. I am here at the University of Louisville. And my presentation is a work in progress. This is my dissertation research. And so the focus of it is on teacher perception of relationship building, particularly investigating personal cultural identities and the impact on that process of relationship building. So I'll start with a statement of the problem and just sort of how, I got interested in this topic and this issue. So I was a classroom teacher, an administrator in middle and high school for about 10 years here in Louisville. And I just consistently found as a building leader and as a team leader that some teachers were better at building positive relationships with students than others. And I don't think that's a revelation. I think that if you walk into any school building, you can see that there are differences between how different teachers interact with students. But I always just wondered, like, why is that so? So I started teaching through the alternative certification pathway here at the University of Louisville. I had no prior experience with, in education. That wasn't my bachelor's background. Not much prior experience teaching students beyond like camps and things like that. But it just sort of came. I don't want to say naturally, but it just worked for me. Like I, went into the classroom. I had relatively few behavior management issues, and I just really connected with students. And so I was just consistently confused to see other teachers not kind of having that experience. And so that's really where it began for me, was just anecdotally, being asked as like a second year teacher to coach someone who had taught for a really long time and not really understanding like why was I able to build these relationships and other people were not. So obviously the more that I learned and the more courses that I took and the more I got invested in education, I started to notice that there was probably something to do with, facets of people's personality, and what I've kind of started to understand now as, cultural mismatches. So potentially in the areas of race, ethnicity, language style, etc. Is that, was that one of the factors or some of the factors that influence someone's ability to build a positive relationship with their students? So we know that the teaching force is predominantly made up of white women, and so of which I am a white woman and consider myself part of that group. And understanding that, as white teachers, many function in cultural spheres where their own norms of setting expectations and demonstrating care for students might differ than what students are kind of expecting in terms of their own culture. But still, the question persisted, like, if I am, a member of this racial group, then why is it working for me? Why is there not seemingly a problem there? So it really just pushed my wondering forward. And so again, as I've researched and I've studied this over the past, 10 or so years of being a student here at U of L, I think the research is pretty clear that poor student-teacher relationships are problematic. So, the question kind of went from a wondering to me to a problem, right? So that's entirely problematic, that relationships impact or can have a negative impact on the personal and academic success of students. And so I wanted to deduce, like, are there certain areas that we can look at that are like the backbone of relationship building? And so I've kind of broken it down into three pieces, and those are the three areas that I've really focused this research on. So one being conveyance of high expectations, the second being demonstrations of care and concern, and the third being honoring students' cultural norms of communication and cultural identities. And so again, the research, really demonstrates that when teachers don't affirm the identities of racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse students, lots of issues arise related to behavior, incidents, low achievement, etc. And that when teachers do convey high expectations, demonstrate care and concern, those are key areas where students given those resources, tend to thrive academically and personally. So through this investigation, my research questions came through, and essentially what I've focused on in this study is how do teachers with certificates in diversity literacy, and I'll talk about this in the participant selection, but essentially the participants all come from a university program that is focused on teacher leadership and diversity literacy. So essentially, how do teachers in that program think about their own personal, racial, ethnic, and linguistic identities during the process of relationship building? And then in what ways do teachers navigate these cultural differences to convey those sentiments of high expectations and care to their students, with the goal being to build positive relationships? So the theoretical frameworks that I've based a lot of this in are in sociocultural theory. So understanding that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum, that students, pick up a lot from their teachers. They understand a lot based on how their teachers interact with them. It's a culturally situated experience. And then looking at it from a critical lens and understanding that those experiences differ when we add a power dynamic, such as one created by race, class, etc. And then I also wanted to look at the area of linguistics. So trying to see, like, in the nuances of how teachers actually speak to students when they're building relationships, is there something there? Is there like a pattern of speech that effective teachers use? Are there certain phrases, terms, so we can get to a deeper understanding of like what is actually happening? So methodology-wise, I used a multiple case study design. So I viewed each teacher as their individual case, bound together by their experience in this program. So looked at each teacher individually with that experience binding them. So because the teachers chosen were from this diversity literacy program, one of the requirements to be in that program is that you have to teach at a school that has certain qualifications. So most importantly, a school that typically has, trends of low achievement, high instances of poverty, and things of that nature. So high need schools as they're defined. So within that selection, teachers also had to be have taught for a few years, so they could not be first-year teachers. So these are what we would call veteran teachers who have taught for multiple years at one of those eligible schools. Of course, anytime you're working with a program that has like a tie to a school or school district, constantly wanting to look at the efficacy of the program. How did the program influence how these teachers have built these relationships and chosen to, exercise their cultural identities in their classroom to leverage those relationships. And then I did use network sampling, and the program itself uses network sampling because there had to be some sort of confirmation from the school building administrator that the teacher was, eligible and would be a good applicant for the program. And then I just followed up with each school building administrator to make sure that the teacher would be considered someone who is good at building relationships, right? So if we're going to use this study as a way to kind of figure out like what makes someone good at building relationships, we would need to have people who are indicated as being, effective at that process. So as I'm sure with everyone's project, I've had to make a lot of adaptations for COVID. So the IRB process, particularly with the school district, took about 6 months. So, there were lots of back and forth. Initially was told I could observe teachers, and then that kind of privilege was taken away as the IRB really wanted to sort of cut down on how much teachers were being burdened by any sort of research. So, through multiple iterations of the study, essentially what the major changes that had to be made were that there would be a focus on fewer teachers. So the district was really adamant that no large scale projects, nothing that would like inundate large amounts of teachers. So I then, of course, had to change the study to adapt to not going into classrooms. So observation was going to be a large component of this research. And so instead of doing observations, teachers were asked to do self-reflection. So writing about their own experience building relationships in their lessons. And then essentially that led me to just have a greater focus on, looking at teacher self-reflections versus any sort of linguistic analysis. So because I couldn't hear what the teachers were saying to their students, that sort of linguistic piece went out, had to be removed a little bit because that data wouldn't have been there. So data collection wise, I modeled the interview self-reflection sequence off of Seidman's 3 interview protocols. So I really wanted to make sure that there was a robust background interview. And so the focus life history was really helpful in understanding teachers' personal experience, how they set up classroom norms, their expectations and beliefs about students, etc. So that interview took place in February 2021. And so currently I do have 4 participants, and I have done the focus life history with all 4 participants. And then sort of, again, modeling off of Seidman's 3 interview protocol, I've added another interview so that teachers are essentially self-reflecting interview, discussion with me, back to self-reflection throughout this entire spring semester. So the school year will end, around May 2021. What's going to be really interesting is that, there will potentially be different experiences being virtual, in person, etc. So that will for sure be, an interesting piece to see if how teachers are building relationships changes drastically when they're in person versus virtual. So I think that'll be just an interesting feature to capture within this research. And then I, again, allowed teachers and hope that teachers will provide other artifacts, things like pictures or posters, visual tools that will give me a better sense of how they're building relationships in their classrooms. So of course, at this point, I've just collected really the first round of data, but I will be using content analysis to kind of order the interview data and self-reflection data. And then I'll go through line by line coding to pull out patterns. So again, the patterns I really want to focus are on high expectations, demonstrating concern and caring, and then understanding of students and personal cultural identities. And then, of course, from there, seeing what other factors can be discovered. And then, of course, during the self-reflections, I asked teachers to identify where they saw those things happening, and then I'll compare them with what I'm seeing. So that'll be part of that coding process. So again, I have just completed the first round of interviews, so getting a better sense of how teachers self-identify, set up structures in their classrooms, etc. But I'm really excited because just in those initial findings, there's a clear indication of teachers focusing on those areas of high expectations, care, concern, and valuing student identities. So it's really reflective of what is in the literature. So that kind of affirms to me that this was a good, a good participant selection, that the teachers are kind of reiterating what is in the research. And then some other theme that I see emerging a lot is this focus on individualized attention. And it's not to say that that isn't in some of the literature, but it's not necessarily always considered the key factor. But that has been something that every single participant has mentioned, that strong relationships require an individual relationship, and that is really important to them. And that goes whether or not they're praising a student or, redirecting a student, it has to be done on an individual level for it to work. And then there's a lot of deep reflection on how their own personal experience in schools and as a cultural being has impacted the process. So, I think that even just their acknowledgement of it and their explanation of how they fit into the fabric of their classroom is really a great initial finding, because I do think, and they've indicated that a lot of that self-perception has come from their coursework and from the information they've learned from this diversity literacy program. So it's definitely giving us insight into, you know, what courses have been effective, and sort of what topics have stood out to teachers, particularly in the area of relationship building. So ultimately, as this study continues, really the goals for the future are to be able to synthesize these teacher practices to teach to new and pre-service teachers. So, you know, I teach here at the University of Louisville in our alternative certification program. And it's really, really hard to explain to someone who's never been in a classroom what concepts like high expectations mean. So I can tell a pre-service teacher all day that you need to maintain high expectations, but that doesn't really like mean a lot out of context. So I think that by being able to kind of synthesize what these teachers are actually doing, we can come up with a list of like, what are some examples of high expectations? What are some examples of demonstrating care, you know, on a very like specific teacher, you know, in the classroom, real sort of level. And then again, you know, with all programs, you want to be able to show that something is effective. And so, you know, another goal is just the hopes that we can continue this program, that we continue to have applicants, and that we continue to offer these types of courses that are, you know, positively impacting the way teachers, you know, build relationships with students. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope to see some of you all at the Q&A session. But again, appreciate it, and good luck with all your own studies.